Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Happy Friday or happy Wednesday. I'm so sorry. Good to see you all. Can you hear me? Because it just tells me there is a poor connection. If you hear me, just wave or say something. Yes. If you type here, that would be very helpful. Hi everyone. Great. So you hear me. That's lovely. So we are going to talk about women's health today, and with Kristen MacCaroll, who helps women with ADHD, especially during perimenopause. So this is a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about all those brain changes and emotional dysregulations, especially during perimenopause. There's such a big link and connection between our brain and ovaries. So this is very, very interesting. We keep hearing recent studies with Dr. Mosconi. So we're going to talk. If you have any questions, as usual, just type it. You can drop it in the comment or in the question bubbles, and within our half an hour talk, if we had a chance, absolutely, we're going to address your questions and concerns. So I'm going to invite Christine. Hi.
Hello there.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good, good. Nice meeting you.
Yeah, you. I was excited a second ago when you said happy Friday. I was like, is it Friday? I was like, oh no.
I
Okay.
know.
I just
Maybe
skipped you.
I'm hoping it was Friday, but actually my favorite day of the week is Wednesday. So,
Oh, wow, perfect. Good
and
timing.
most Wednesdays I have live on my Insta. So I'm looking forward to our talk today. So do you like to, I'd love to hear about yourself, and if you could introduce yourself to everyone here.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Christine MacCaroll. I'm a functional nutritionist and a certified brain health professional. So I've been working with women's health and women's hormones for a decade, but I started diving into the specifics around ADHD a couple of years ago when I got a late diagnosis and my daughter was diagnosed at the same time. So I've really dialed into helping badass women who are struggling in midlife with ADHD and helping them to supercharge their brains without using medication.
Amazing. It's great. Um, so I mean, in my practice, especially, I see a lot of women with during their perimenopause or menopause, and then a lot of these women have sudden onset, or they are diagnosed with symptoms of ADD or ADHD during this period of time, or they have been diagnosed, or just symptoms suddenly exacerbate and get worse during this time, and they come and tell me that the medication dose is not enough anymore for them, or they want a higher dose or change and switch to another medication. So let us know your experience with women, and your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to unpack, I think, in what you just said, but certainly the rates have about doubled in the last few years of women getting a diagnosis, and it's usually in midlife. So if women were not diagnosed as children, the average age of diagnosis is like 36 to 38. I actually think that because that's an average, it really actually skews higher. It's really more to the 40s. Some more of that awareness has made some younger women get diagnosed a little bit earlier. But I think there's a few reasons for that. Primary reason is that, so I'm 46. When I was a kid in the 80s, this was not a diagnosis for girls. So this was it's like an issue for little boys, and little boys present really differently from little girls. So thought that it was a little boy issue, and the hyperactivity for little boys is on the outside. A lot of times for girls, it's in our brains, so it's not as visible. And we also thought that it was something that people would outgrow. We didn't realize that there was actual structural brain differences in people with ADHD. And so those two things mean that for a lot of women, a diagnosis was not available when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is when we have these hormonal changes in midlife, women across the board are going to have brain changes. So we're already going to be having a lot of those same symptoms, some of the brain fog and forgetfulness and, those executive function challenges. And if there was already underlying ADHD, it's going to really highlight that. So I talk about this as, if you've maybe had simmering symptoms for your whole life, all of a sudden we change the hormones in perimenopause and menopause, and now those symptoms are at a boil. So, there is a strong overlap. It's interesting. I've seen this question a lot about, is it perimenopause or is it ADHD? And I do think for some women, it really is just perimenopause. And we do need to recognize that there is just an underlying hormonal imbalance that needs to be addressed. But then also there is this subset of women that really actually have had ADHD for their entire lives, and it does just get substantially worse in perimenopause. And we just need to know that we actually now have two issues to deal with and not just one.
Yeah, it's true. Some women just mimic the symptoms of ADHD during perimenopause due to all those fluctuations of the hormones, that inattention or problem, poor time management, brain fog, memory problem, focus problems. But as you mentioned, it's a little bit tricky to diagnose. First of all, tell me what do you normally do with the diagnostics, how you diagnose and try to make difference between these two, which is sometimes overlap.
Mm-hmm. So first I have to be clear that I don't diagnose. That is out of my scope of practice. But where I usually direct women to have conversations with their providers if they need a diagnosis, is the first thing is if you look at your life and you go back and you say, have these symptoms been present for my entire life? And what I've seen is that for a lot of women, we're seeing our children get a diagnosis. So, my daughter was diagnosed, and then when we see the list of symptoms that were given from the school or from the pediatrician's office, and we go, oh wow, those symptoms that are true for my kid, that was me as a kid and maybe also me now, right? So if you can look back and say, this has actually been something that's been going on throughout my life, it's perhaps more likely that that is an underlying diagnosis and not something new in perimenopause. If you look back and you say, actually, I haven't had any of these symptoms my whole life, and all of a sudden things feel really different, then that may be something more to do with those hormonal changes in midlife specifically, and not really, an overlap there. So like for me personally, getting that diagnosis, like going back, like it was so crazily clear for me. It just like made my whole life come into focus and make sense. Like I could just look back on my whole life and go, wow, everything makes sense now. Been true for me, as long as I can possibly remember, versus some women that I talk to are like, it feels like a sudden onset. And I'm like, ooh, that's probably not, I'm not going to diagnose, but probably not going to be ADHD. And so it's just a lot of the, the root cause kind of supports are similar, but there is a specific difference because of the genetics and the difference in brain structure if it's actually an ADHD underlying issue.
Yes, it's just amazing how, I was just reading about all these studies, especially with Dr. Mosconi's studies and researches, how women in perimenopause, over 80% of us experience some neurologic symptoms during this period of time, which is quite a huge stat, 80%. So, and then again, on top of that, other mood swings and depression, anxiety, panic attacks, brain fog, we have ADHD too, which makes it even more complex.
Yeah.
So how do you normally, so when the woman who comes to you with diagnosis of ADHD or ADD, what is the approach normally? What's the steps how you help them?
Yeah. So I absolutely believe in a foundational approach first. is, my background is functional nutrition. I'm looking at, are we eating foods that help our brains work better? And are we removing foods that are inflammatory to the brain? So I'm really looking at this as it's a brain health issue. And it's just continues to blow my mind that we talk about mental health without talking about brain health. Like, we're not actually talking about the health of the organ that's involved. So, foundational levels with something like nutrition are neurotransmitters. So for ADHD, for anyone who doesn't know this, one of the primary issues is with the neurotransmitter dopamine. So it's either low dopamine, or we actually genetically, a lot of people process dopamine really quickly. So even if we're producing a normal amount of dopamine, it's clearing from our bodies really fast. So we don't get like the benefits of the dopamine. So that neurotransmitter is built from amino acids, and amino acids just are what we get from digesting protein. So if you look at a standard American diet over the last 50 years, we've substantially decreased the amount of protein that we're eating. So we simply don't have the building blocks. Like, I think about this as we're missing the Legos that we need to have neurotransmitters that are going to, build a healthy brain. We're also eating a lot of inflammatory seed oils and fats that are not helping with the structure of the brain. So again, we're just thinking about structure and biology here. Our brain is mostly made of fat. So if we have high quality and healthy fats, the actual tissue of your brain is going to be of higher quality than if we're eating a lot of low quality fats from highly processed foods. And that difference is going to make a lot of difference in how our brain feels and functions. So really basic steps, like making sure that you're getting lots of protein in your diet, especially usually at the beginning of the day, to make sure that you have good energy balance throughout the day. Having a lot of high quality fats are super important foundational items. So if we can't do anything else, we have to start with that like food first approach. And then at that point, we can look at things like, is your digestive system functioning? So, getting access to those proteins, we have to have good digestion. We know that the gut is the second brain. So if we're supposed to be producing a lot of our dopamine and serotonin from the gut, and we're not because we have an imbalanced gut, that's going to be a big issue. And then, of course, as I'm sure I don't know about your audience, but we have all of these changes that happen to the gut in perimenopause and menopause, and those changes are going to then exacerbate again kind of the issues that could be making an ADHD brain feel worse. Detoxification is important. Again, if we're looking at what's inflaming the brain, if we are exposed to a lot of toxins, certainly as a woman in midlife with my skin getting dry and all of a sudden wrinkles happening and all of this stuff, I'm looking at like, oh, what are my new, wrinkle treatments and all of that? And some of those are really toxic, or they're really dysregulating to our hormones. And so if we're, adding things that are toxic, again, our skin is a really highly absorbent organ, and so those toxins can go and infiltrate our brains. So we need to be looking at detoxification, and of course hormone balance. So dopamine and estrogen and progesterone have a really tight relationship. So one of the reasons that those symptoms get a lot worse in perimenopause is because of those hormonal fluctuations that are changing how our brains are reacting to our neurotransmitters. So, I really look at, hey, we have to start with foundational level stuff. We have to be feeding our brains well. We have to be reducing inflammation. We have to take out the toxic things. And then we have to look at how are your hormones working. And if we have, if you're experiencing a lot of hormone dysregulation, it's not going to be like the root cause of ADHD, but absolutely it's going to be making things feel a lot worse. So I think about like what's making your brain feel worse and how can we make our brains feel better.
So it's a very holistic approach. So we're dealing with nutrients and nutrient deficiencies if there is a problem with the intake or absorption. So if there is a gut health problem, to address that, and also detox, which is a very important part that we in conventional medicine a lot of times miss or overlook. That detoxification pathways. So do you run any tests, functional tests, during your seeing patients and helping them?
Yeah. So, again, always starting with like the basics that don't require testing, other than like, hey, you should look at your nutrient intake. You should look at like, are you getting enough grams of protein every day? Like your basic, like 30 grams of protein at breakfast. If we're looking at nutritional status, I do think it's really important to look at your micronutrients. So, it always again kind of blows my mind where conventionally we don't acknowledge that there is a lot of research on some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of kids, if they get zinc, will need to have either a lower dose of ADHD medication or no medication at all. So looking at zinc status is really important. Iron is required for production of dopamine. So looking at any underlying deficiencies in iron is really important. Magnesium is important. Again, we can see changes in ADHD symptoms with sufficient magnesium. So if we look at micronutrient status, I do think that's one of those primary pieces. I also love the omega quant. So looking at your ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, we want, of course, sufficient omega-3s and that anti-inflammatory support for our brains. For people with ADHD, actually a higher EPA to DHA ratio is important in an omega. So we have a different requirement from average brain health, which usually emphasizes DHA. So I always start with like, hey, how are your nutrients? Then I absolutely would say some of the foundational things like thyroid function and blood sugar are things that impact our ADHD brains as well. So these are things, again, like I think every woman should be looking at. This is not like unique to ADHD, but we just tend to have a more extreme response to some of those things. Looking at gut health is really important. So absolutely a GI map. There are, again, research is clear on this. There are differences in the microbiome of people who have ADHD and people who don't. So looking at how you're absorbing your nutrients, and then are there different kinds of probiotics that we can be strategic about that would help your brain to feel better. Detoxification, certainly looking like you can look at a urinary organic acids test. You can see if there's toxins that you're exposed to. How's your body metabolizing? And then I'll tell you, like for myself, I just looked at my Dutch recently. I was like, okay, well, how am I metabolizing estrogen right now? Because I know that estrogen metabolism is going to affect how my brain works. So again, I don't think these are necessarily, besides maybe an omega quant or urinary neurotransmitters, which I will look at as well. I think maybe those two are specific to ADHD, but otherwise they're things that anyone in a functional practice would be looking at. I just look at it with the lens of how is this affecting how your brain feels.
Yeah. That's very interesting, and I normally add, definitely I'm sure that you do too, antioxidants, especially during perimenopause with all those changes in brain and hormonal fluctuations. Definitely it's very important to add in all those vegetables and antioxidants, berries and fruits into your diet. So important. So with diet, you mentioned anti-inflammatory and high protein and good fat. Anything else you add with spices or any other specific food?
Yeah, so I think there's also things to be aware of as things to avoid. Let's say one other thing that we maybe want to focus on in including is good quality wild caught fish. So like any of those fatty fish that are going to have those high omega-3s are helpful. Wild caught is important. But I have seen it's in the research, and I've also seen, so I started looking at genetics for my clients for the last 2 years, and I started tracking on a spreadsheet. So this is not formal. This is not like publishable research studies, but every single person who has a genetic predisposition towards ADHD that I have seen in my practice also has issues with gluten. 100%. So either, potential genetics for celiac or for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. About 75% of the people have issues with lactose and dairy digestion. So, that's pretty well established in autism, which is kind of a sister diagnosis. There's a pretty big overlap in autism and ADHD as a diagnosis. And gluten and dairy tend to be triggers for a lot of people. So I know that it's just like, oh, it's just two things, but it's a lot. It's really hard for a lot of people to take those things out, but just taking those out can have a really profound impact in how someone's brain feels. The other thing you mentioned about antioxidants. So Again, I've seen it's in the literature, and I've seen this in my practice and looking at genetics, is often people who have ADHD or predisposition also have genetics that predispose them to not detoxing very
Mm-hmm.
well. So having higher antioxidants, but also looking at things like glutathione, which is our mother antioxidant, like we should be making that on our own. But a lot of people, myself included, maybe we're missing that capability or we have an impaired ability to glutathione. So it becomes even more important to not have toxic food, to not have foods that are going to inflame the brain, because it's that much harder actually for our bodies to handle. So the lowest possible inflammatory diet for a lot of people also means taking out like gluten, dairy, inflammatory fats and oils. Other than that, specific foods probably depend on if someone, like if we look at their nutrient status and they're missing certain nutrients, I might say, okay, well, we need to look at foods that are supportive. Blueberries, interestingly, there was a research study that came out last week. I haven't read the full paper, but blueberries actually, like, I never think of a food necessarily, like here's one food, but they showed evidence of supporting ADHD symptoms. So I was like, hey, that's an amazing thing and super easy to put into most people's diets. So yeah.
I know. It's absolutely right. And so with that, we talked about, and then of course, avoiding processed food. And I've seen in my practice, kids, women, men, when they work on their diet, it's just amazing. They see great result and outcome just simply by avoiding elimination diet, removing that gluten, as you mentioned, dairy, and all those processed inflammatory foods. They feel already much better.
Mm-hmm.
less less medication, lower doses of medications that they're already on. So that definitely very important. So we talked about diet. What about, so you mentioned about some supplements or added into your food like magnesium, zinc. So do you do any specific omega-3, any specific supplements that you recommend to your patients after all those testing you do?
Yeah. So I have a podcast. It's called ADHD Naturally: Smart Solutions for Holistic Women. My next season is going to start next week, and it's actually 18 different supplements that I've identified. So either a nutrient or adaptogens, herbs, botanicals that actually have support in the literature. So I'm going to go deep on that on that topic.
Mm-hmm.
But as a couple of like a broad brush stroke, so I mentioned omega-3s. I think that's a critical component, and looking at that high EPA to DHA ratio. So if you're looking at your omega, it will say on the back, like it will break it down into that category. And you want one where if you look at that ratio, EPA is relatively high to DHA. So that's very supportive for an ADHD brain. Other things that I give to my kid, I always start with, foundational things that are really helpful. Tyrosine is a precursor to dopamine. We also can get that from foods. So like turkey is one of the highest tyrosine containing foods. So that's an easy dietary source, but supplementally, it's really supportive as well. Theanine is another amino acid. So tyrosine and theanine are two amino acids that work really nicely together. So tyrosine helps with dopamine. It's like a precursor, so production. Theanine is calming. And so one of the things that's often a misconception for women with ADHD is, some women have, this mixed type where we look more hyperactive, but a lot of women, that hyperactivity is all going on in the brain. So it's just like a brain that's going 1,000 miles per hour. And theanine is calming to the brain. So it's really helpful as something to kind of just turn down the noise on that radio station. So I really love theanine and tyrosine together. There's another botanical called mucuna, which is also called velvet bean, that has some natural dopamine in it. So I'm actually working on developing a supplement myself that has that ingredient because it's a beautiful support for the brain. Is an antioxidant that also helps with slowing down dopamine degradation in the brain. So if we are also, if you're like have a lot of sensitivities, if you have food allergies or food sensitivities, that can be worsening how your brain feels, because histamine and is really like inflammatory to the brain. So quercetin kind of does a twofold thing there. It helps to calm down any inflammation that you might be feeling from those sensitivities, but it also slows down the degradation of dopamine. So it helps our brains feel better for longer. So those are some things I always start with. Magnesium is also calming. Magnesium can help with sleep. So I love magnesium, especially at night. And I think those are probably some of the key ones. Again, I have 18 different things that I've identified, and I have a long list, and we'll be going into that in the podcast. But those are kind of the places where I would start for most people who are just looking for some additional, like, natural support for having better focus.
Amazing. That's great. And what about, so we discussed supplements and a diet. Any talk about sleep and physical activity? What are the recommendations? Some of people, patients with ADD and ADHD, have a very hard time to switch off and go to sleep. So what we do about that?
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, like looking at those genetics, genetically, there's a big overlap there. So we have a lot of dysregulation from the genetic level with sleep, with ADHD. So it becomes that much harder. And to me, I'm like, my take on that is, yes, it's harder. And that just means we need more support there. It doesn't mean, oh, okay, well, it's just harder for me, I'm going to stay up all night, which is what a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's how I'm wired. But really what happens is that we get into a vicious cycle of, we're not sleeping. We feel worse the next day. Sleep, again, across the board for everybody, is going to impact cognition and function, and focus the next day. So that's already true. If you have an ADHD brain that struggles to focus and now you're sleep deprived, now we've just put gasoline on the fire. So I will say, for me personally, I am ridiculous about my sleep. My husband makes fun of me for how, like, protective I am of my sleep, but I absolutely am making sure I'm doing everything I can to ensure that I'm getting good sleep. So unfortunately, sadly for me, that means I can't drink alcohol the way that I used to. I have to limit, 1-2 glasses of wine a week. I can't do more than that. It really messes with my sleep. I'm really clean about, like, when I go to bed and when I wake up, getting sunlight in the morning, really important for setting our circadian rhythm. And then, sometimes there is a melatonin dysregulation component with ADHD a lot of times. So sometimes melatonin as a support. I do think people have to be careful not to get stuck on melatonin, but if it's like something that really helps you to regulate your sleep cycle, taking some melatonin before bed to get that regulated. But our brains are already sensitive. And so again, like when we're just thinking about an ADHD brain and that heightened sensitivity, I'm about getting enough sleep. So I have my wind down routine. I have my little stack of supplements that I take at night. So magnesium is certainly a big one. I have others, other amino acids that I do at night to help me sleep. I always have a really cool house. I make sure it's super dark, super protect sleep. And then you asked about activity and exercise. So again, lots of research on this, which is amazing. And what I think is is that everybody, and especially people with ADHD, we get a natural afterglow effect of focus and attention for 1 to 3 hours after exercise. So if you are looking at your day and you're thinking like, oh my gosh, I have this one thing I really have to focus for during the day, or I have this project that's due, or whatever it is, if you have the ability to time your exercise or even get in like a really brisk 10-minute walk right before then, we have that great afterglow effect of our brains just work better for an hour to 3 hours. So it's a really simple strategy for managing your time and your energy. But absolutely, like any kind of exercise, but certainly we want to be getting blood flow to the brain in general. And there's that good afterglow we can get.
Yeah, definitely. Cardiovascular, cardiac is so important to do exercise, walking, as you mentioned, running, jogging. All of them are great for that brain stimulus. And
I get the oxygen up there.
Yeah, it's so important, and it helps. The more strengthening and resistance training helps with the mood, but with the brain functionality and focus, that cardiac is so important. So anything else? So where can people, do you look after patients or see patients online, virtually, and is it globally or is it just located where you are?
Yeah, I have a totally virtual practice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so the my website is just my name, ChristineMacCaroll.com. I'm here on Instagram, and like I said, I have the podcast. I'm it's rebranded, so I was 5 years doing women's health on that podcast, and it's rebranded to specifically women with ADHD. So this first season has really been about some of that background. Next season is going to be all about supplements, and then we'll be going into some things like functional labs and things like we just talked about here. So for people who are just kind of learning about this or interested, or again, like a lot of women are getting a late diagnosis, and so if they're realizing or questioning or saying like, could this be me, those are some resources and places to start.
Yeah, as you mentioned again, I see a lot of patients, a lot of women who come with kids who
Yeah,
diagnosed with ADHD, and they just look at them and they say, oh, this is me completely. I have all those symptoms and never diagnosed. Or then during perimenopause, they have more symptoms. They be able to maybe control, but now it's out of whack because of all those hormonal fluctuations up and down, significant decline in estrogen. So all of those affect. And from my practice, I've seen women who I started on hormone replacement therapy definitely feel better, and we lower dose of their ADHD medications due to that estrogen or estradiol effects on their brain with better.
Yeah, estrogen potentiates dopamine. So when we fall off the estrogen cliff, then we fall off the dopamine cliff too. So yeah, we need that support.
It was lovely having you today. Great. Lovely, lovely talk and chat. And certainly we can do this again soon. And your podcast about supplements, I don't want to miss that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Have a lovely day.
You
Everyone,
too.
thank you for being here. Good to see you all. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye, Christine.
Bye.